Harvey may have left us physically on 13 September 2020, but he cannot be forgotten, as he resides here forever, his architectural and personal spirit firmly embedded in every element of the house. Fagin's domestic architecture was the focus of my PhD, which was completed in 2012. Today I will focus on his responses to the influences of the modern movement, particularly through his education at the University of Pretoria. To construct a graphic understanding of my PhD, which I'll summarize for you, I use Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvian Man as a representation of Fagin. I argued that Fagin is a mediator of a number of concerns, which then, through his architectural intellect and training and spirit, forge new ways of making. Through this process, he crystallizes his architectural, foundational, and practical experiences. Fagin once remarked that a child can only fully develop if hand and mind are taught to work in synergy. Fagin's upbringing was clearly formed along these lines, but a healthy dose of intelligence, creative genes, and a privileged upbringing created a solid platform for these traits to develop to their full potential. Fagin grew up in a well-respected family that encouraged artistic pursuits, such as drama and writing. Fagin was also influenced by his father's creative abilities, and so from an early age began to take mechanical objects apart and invent new ways of making. After Fagin completed his high school education in 1942, he enrolled in a mechanical engineering course at the University of Cape Town. In those days, there were no prior applications or interviews. Fagin's older brother Henny took him to registration day, and as Fagin was unsure what to study, he ended up standing in a queue with his brother. During the 4 years at the University of Cape Town, Fagin developed his technological pursuits and musical hobbies, but also met his future wife, Gwen. During his engineering studies, Fagin was clearly more interested in pursuing his technological interests, and bought about 13 second-hand motorcycles that he repaired and sold on, finally purchasing, with the proceeds of his sales and music performances, an Adler, an open-topped German sports car. After Fagin finished studies at the University of Pretoria, he worked for Volkskas Bank for about 10 years from 1952 onwards. There he mediated the concerns of corporate expression and the need for a regional affiliation. But Fagin's life extended beyond architecture. He was a family man with 4 children, including a prominent Cape Town engineer Henny, and 3 daughters, Helena, Jessie, and Alida, all musically inclined, just as their father, who played the piano and guitar. Fagin ran his own dairy in Pretoria in the 1950s, flew planes, and manned boats and yachts. He made an epic journey from Portugal to Mossel Bay in a replica caravel to celebrate the 500th anniversary of Dyer's arrival in the Cape in 1488, while in 1982 Fagin won the transatlantic Cape to Punta del Este yacht race, and in 2003 the transatlantic yacht race to Bahia. Fagin's architecture is a unique expression that results in buildings and places deeply rooted in history and place. Fagin has developed a deep understanding of the Cape vernacular through his heritage work such as at Tilbach and the Castle of Good Hope in Cape Town. But he has also developed a deep appreciation of Cape Dutch vernacular through its various iterations. While his understanding of the tenets of the modern movement, as will be explained later, have forged ways of understanding modern living conditions and the possibilities of using new technologies. The influences of architects like Pancho Guedes, who worked in Mozambique, and whose buildings Fagin made a photographic record of in the 1950s, as well as Le Corbusier's vernacular experiments and the teachings at the University of Pretoria, all fueled Fagin's understanding of an already mediated modern movement approach. Fagin's regionalist approach to architecture has its origins in an intimate childhood understanding of place and a less theoretical architectural education that fostered pragmatic yet independent thought while accentuating the necessities of modern-day life. It also originated in a world removed from mainstream modern movement architecture and a waning but Waterstrand Department of Architecture influence. The work of Fagin is certainly informed by the regional shifts that were taking place in Transvaal at the time of his education, but his buildings developed a character and local influence of their own. They are therefore reactions from a peripheral contextual position. Fagin's architecture aligns itself with the architect Pallasma's view that regional character is formed from contradictory ingredients, as well as the historian Louis Mumford's view that it will be useful if we formed the habit of never using the word regional without mentally adding to it the idea of the universal, remembering the constant contact and interchange between the local scene and the wide world that lies beyond it. Fagin's childhood experiences laid the foundation for a thorough interrogation and understanding of context. He developed an appreciation of the earth and its qualities through his tunneling exploits in the garden, the building of shelters, and the moulding of mud and clay. Initial gliding forays sensitized Fagin to the effects of air, while boating and sailing synthesized the effects of air and water on the human body. These influences allowed Fagin to develop an inventive attitude that, as time progressed, was honed into an intuitive ability to manipulate all things technological and respond to all contextual influences. Hand and mind were developed equally, while natural talents seamlessly combined with creative nurturing from parents, family, and friends. Through his creative abilities, Fagin has developed a unique architectural expression. Fagin's work is influenced by the inherited vernaculars of the Cape region through a traditive architectural approach, founded on the old, but developed to suit varying contexts, climates, available materials, and cultural practices. Fagin regards these traditions as important for the development of architecture in South Africa, and as the historian Curtis notes, many late modern movement architects made an effort to unearth fundamental lessons in local tradition and to blend them with an already evolved modern language. Fagin also understands that a reinvention of the architectural wheel is not necessary. He concurs with the historian Mumford, who warned that invention could become a duty, and that like a child delighted with a new toy, we may lose sight of the guidance that must come from critical discernment. As I will elaborate on later, Fagin's domestic architecture is a mediation between the orthodoxy of pastoral modernity, the initial perhaps naive programmatic modernity espoused by the youthful enthusiasm of the Transvaal group in the early 1930s, and the later regional modern expression of the Pretoria School. It is a mediation of definitions of the modern that refer to contemporaneity and transiency. Its formal and spatial nature, although timeless, borders on a counter-pastoral view of modernity, as Fagin's approach has not changed much over time, and the tenets of functional orthodoxy still remain. The core constituents of Fagin's architecture are a functional and pragmatic approach influenced by Le Corbusier and the mediated regional approach to the modern movement through Fagin's education at the University of Pretoria. Fagin's response was formed to an already established recognition of the limitations of modernist orthodoxy, as the failures of the Transvaal group's orthodox architecture were apparent early on. It was the task of the new breed of architects to attend to these problems, while aligning themselves with functionalist viewpoints to establish new ways of living in response to climate, place, and materials. Fagin's architecture does not reject universal modernism, but bears similarities to regionalism in its respect for the qualities of materials and structure. The resultant architecture is less about resistance and more about engagement, and in the process creates a relative regionalism by mediating between these opposing approaches. Fagin's architecture can also be located at a junction between the nostalgic regional approach of Martin Heidegger and later Norbert Schultz, and the radicalism of Paul Ricoeur. It does not attempt to counter the Ricoeurian crisis of civilization by negating modernity and relying only on tradition or regionalism, in the strictest sense of the word, but accepts the functionalist and technological principles of the modern project. Fagin's architecture differs from a critical regionalist standpoint, as it does not react against universalization and its formalist tendencies, nor is it an architecture of resistance. It was formed outside mainstream modernist influences, in a time and place where issues of global consumption had not yet taken hold. Also, critical regionalism reacted in the main against the work of the cliched postmodern historicists, the effects of only which reached South Africa in the late 1970s. Fagin's architecture is also a learned response through the influences of clients and their needs. Interestingly, 5 houses were designed for family members. The design of the houses is also deeply influenced by the nature of the various sites, their topography, views, and climate. Through creative processes, a number of architectural themes have been developed by Fagin, which I refer to as tensions and mediations. These are the relationship between science and experience, form and context, space and place, form and function, and technology and form. As a result of these mediative themes, Fagin has developed unique architectural heterotypologies that he has used intermittently and variously throughout his career. These are generative, such as the cellar, the hearth, the covered courtyard, the open courtyard, and defensive elements such as the wall and the roof, which are all founded in centuries of architectural tradition. He has also developed productive typologies, which relate to functional derivations. They are productive also as they relate to the functional tenets of the modern movement, such as health and efficiency. The resultant typologies that often occur in Fagin's work are the linear attenuated plan, the guided entrance, the relationship between typology and topography, the chimney as focus.
Do unmute yourselves and ask Arthur your own comments directly. Which school did he go to?
He went to the Afrikaans High School in Cape Town, which is called, now the name escapes me. Van Riebeeck, yeah, that's right. Where did his parents live? They lived in Newlands, in a house very close to the station.
Okay, sorry, I started a bit prematurely there. Is everyone okay? I'll start the second chapter.
The movement expressed the programmatic and pastoral view of modernity. The second period of the modern movement is defined by Judica as spanning a period of 10 years from 1930 to 1939, that is in Europe until the Second World War began. He suggests that modern architecture had spread across Europe in variations, influenced by climate, topography, and tradition. The expression of modernity was certainly still programmatic, but after the CIAM conference of 1928, Collins and John Wilson argued that another tradition of modern architecture was formed, as an inner critique of pastoral modernity. The third period of the modern movement can be said to have developed after the Second World War, which was followed by a period of physical, social, and economic reconstruction. Modernity shifted from a programmatic bias to a transitory one. The 1947 CIAM meeting resulted in a reconsideration of its original orthodox position, arguing for an architecture that would meet the material and emotional needs of society. The idealist phase of the modern movement was over, and as Girardo and Curtis argue, universal prototypes began to be misapplied, while revolution was replaced with capitalism. Not only was the design mantra transported across the world, but its more successful variants were contextualized to suit place, culture, and available technologies. In essence, a vernacularization of the tenets, such as modern living, associated spatial configurations, and the influences of local technologies occurred. This was exemplified in the South African domestic architecture of Gawie Fagan, born on the 15th of November 1925. The first rumblings of an inherited modern movement in South Africa were recorded by Stanley Furner when he became head of the Wits School in 1925 and editor of the South African Architectural Record in 1926. His publication, The Modern Movement in South Africa, was, according to Herbert, a seminal piece for the future of architecture, as it expressed a clear understanding of the logic and philosophy of modernity steering skillfully clear of issues such as style and aesthetics. This can be regarded, however, as a second modern movement in the international sense, due to its European inheritance. The Wits graduate Rex Martinson's direct contact with Le Corbusier paved the way for the distillation of modern movement tenets, mainly in the Transvaal, after Martinson had taken over the editorship of the South African Architectural Record in 1932. Together with a small band of like-minded protagonists like Gordon McIntosh and Norman Hanson, that were later referred to as the Transvaal Group, Martinson forged an alliance that led to the publication of 0 Hour on 1 April 1933. This manifesto proclaimed the virtues of new technologically and functionally driven architecture and was widely disseminated even to the master himself. It was well received by Le Corbusier, who published the letter he wrote to Martinson in 1936. In the 1930s, a small number of Le Corbusier-inspired houses were built, such as House Monroe in Victoria by Mackintosh in 1932, House Harris in Houghton 1933 by Hanson, Tompkin and Finkelstein, and the Climax House Stern in 1934 in Johannesburg by Martinson, Fazler and Cook. In 1938, Le Corbusier's Mathers House was published in the March issue of the South African Architectural Record, 4 years after Martinson's House Stern. Le Corbusier used both Platonic and tectonic forms, but his work alternated between idealist and realist forms and pastoral and counter-pastoral modernities. Fagin notes that as students they were shocked at Le Corbusier's organic design of La Chapelle de Notre-Dame de Hart-de-Dronchamp, but Fagin must have unconsciously absorbed the master's earlier mediative strategies, as they are very evident in his architecture. Their common affinities for the simple qualities and pure forms of Mediterranean architecture, in Fagin's case to the Portuguese influence on the Dutch, had fostered a similarity of approach. Although Martinson too had investigated Mediterranean and Cape examples, he chose to follow the master's idealist aesthetic rather than develop his own. Fagin and his fellow students at the University of Pretoria during 1947 to 1951 were heavily influenced by the work of Le Corbusier. They bought his books and devoured his architecture. And in 1991, Fagin remarked, "But the basic stuff of architecture is also Martinson's related volumes, defined by Le Corbusier's mass, surface and plan." Barry Beeman and I were once pondering the contorted surfaces of a new building. After long silence he said in his laconic way, "Be thankful that we were taught in a more disciplined time." And I am truly thankful because the Cubist discipline taught us the basic stuff of architecture. The Villa Savoye has to precede Ronchamp. But Fagin was also influenced by the transmigration of other architectures like Brazil builds, through his teachers, and the publications and development of Pretoria regionalism. Fagin's domestic architecture is a mediation between the orthodoxy of pastoral modernity, the initial perhaps naive programmatic modernity espoused by the youthful enthusiasm of the Transvaal Group in South Africa in the early 1930s, and the later regional modern expression of the Pretoria School. It is a mediation of definitions of the modern that refer to contemporaneity and transiency. Its formal and spatial nature, although timeless, borders on a counter-pastoral view of modernity, as Fagin's approach has not changed that much over time, and the tenets of functional orthodoxy remain. The core constituents of his architecture are a functional and pragmatic approach, influenced by Le Corbusier, and the mediated regional approach to the modern movement through Fagin's education at the University of Pretoria. His response was formed through an already established recognition of the limitations of modernist orthodoxy, as the failures of the Transvaal Group's orthodox architecture were apparent early on. It was the task of the new breed of architects to attend to these problems, while aligning themselves with functionalist viewpoints to establish new ways of living. But Fagin's creative foundations were already initiated in his youth, and with his two brothers, through his affinity with all things natural and local. His schoolwork was replaced by boat-building forays on the Liesbeek River, accompanied by tunnel building in his mother's rose garden and tree house building in neighbors' properties. Making was an ever-present pursuit that continued unabated, while Fagin attempted engineering studies at UCT. Music, maidens and motorcycles won the day, resulting in his mother sending him off to the University of Pretoria, in 1947. It is telling perhaps that Fagin was inspired by the regionalist leanings of Le Corbusier's proposed house in Chile, Errázuriz, in 1930, which Frampton notes saw Le Corbusier's first employment of a pitched roof since Le Char de Fonds. Even Hitchcock, who espoused the international style in the Museum of Modern Art publication of the same name, rather apologetically notes that Le Corbusier had already used characteristics of the new cottage style in House Errázuriz. The house was to be constructed of random rubble stone walling and an exposed timber roof structure, but as Le Corbusier himself had already noted, the rusticity of the materials is in no way a hindrance to the expression of a clear plan and a modern aesthetic. The modern movement's search for appropriate forms led many architects to look at the architecture of the Mediterranean, as its formal and material simplicity exemplified the tenets of the modernist project and a non-facile traditionalism. Fagin's hero Le Corbusier was no exception, and the formal dialectics expressed in his work as orthodox and organic were representative of his ability to design according to the circumstances, using materials appropriate for the condition. It is important to understand these mediations in Le Corbusier's work, as Fagin was to adopt many of the same approaches. Even Rex Martinson understood the value of the Mediterranean vernacular. While in his final year at University Pretoria, Fagin designed a house for his parents in Bishop's Court, Cape Town, clearly influenced by Le Corbusier's Errázuriz house in Chile. The bagged and painted brickwork and organically shaped internal recess marked the beginnings of Fagin's lifelong formal synergy between the planar architecture of the modern movement and the Mediterranean and local Cape vernacular traditions. The centralized living area with roof light carefully negotiates the sloping site with a generous ramp and downward focusing roof which slowly reveals the rear of Table Mountain. The lower ground floor is firmly embedded in the earth, creating an intimate yet externally connected space. Although Fagin was steeped in an orthodox modern movement and Le Corbusier-inspired education, his lecturers at the University of Pretoria had already absorbed the master's principles and had moved to making a regionalist-inspired modern movement. Norman Eaton was a part-time lecturer at the University of Pretoria and a major exponent of this contextual way of thinking. Another influential lecturer was Helmut Stark, who was born in Germany. He studied design at the Ittenschule and thereafter the Technische Hochschule Berlin and emigrated to South Africa in 1935. He joined the Department of Architecture at the University of Pretoria in 1943 and taught there for 5 years. He was well liked and respected by the students, but he was a perfectionist in functional terms, probably due to the economic circumstances of the time and his modern movement training. Stark believed that nothing must be wasted, least of all space. He taught evidently not by discussion, but through his 6B pencil. A very important figure in Fagin's life was Basil South. It is uncertain when he was appointed in the department, but he died from the effects of tick bite fever while still a lecturer. Steenkamp notes that he was a gentle giant and that the students could relate to him easily. He was also knowledgeable and theoretically inclined, but with a definite pragmatic bias that distilled a design to its purest form. Another influence was Rob Colbaum, a creative designer of individuality and great sensibility, who worked with a clear and simple rationale. His dynamic teachings at the School of Architecture introduced an adventurous attitude of independent, if less academic, thought. He was a practical architect and insisted on students knowing exactly what it is they were drawing, so much so that items of clothing had to be measured to design shelf sizes. Fagin was, however, critical of this meticulous detailing and fastidious knowledge of housewives' cutlery collections, as this approach limits flexibility and alters people's lives too much. Colbaum noted that the needs of the family were paramount, while climate and materials act as the other design informants. In his houses, living and sleeping spaces are all oriented north, with roof overhangs carefully calculated to keep the sun out in summer. As the clients were not wealthy, an economical and efficient layout had to be designed. Entrance halls were done away with, and all services were combined to allow, as he saw it, the alleged machine for living to function on tick-over and full revs without a sticky trail of services stretching embarrassingly in front of family living and entertainment areas. While at the University of Pretoria, Fagin excelled academically while displaying great prowess as a designer. with his prize-winning projects being featured in a number of the journals of the South African Institute of Architects. There is a marked modern movement influence in his architecture, particularly in his thesis project, which espoused elements of the Brazilian modern movement.
Yes, I've answered some of the questions people have asked. They wanted to know who Fagin's siblings were. He had two, one who died in his early 50s and another who died about 2 or 3 years ago, who was a lawyer. And then Fagin's father was a judge. And then Ian gave me a heads up, but I responded, Ian, if you could please let me know who the owner of that Rebel Fox house is. I would love to make a proper record of it. That's it for now.
Sorry, Arthur, I was wondering with those, there's like House Stern, those very purist modernist houses, do they still exist? I noticed the photos are quite old.
Yeah, there's one, I think Munro still exists in Pretoria in altered fashion. And then one of the Martinson houses, I think his own house is owned by an architect and was renovated probably about 2 or 3 years ago.
Yes. Yes. It's been beautifully done. I covered it last talk. And
wonderful.
The designer who beautifully converted it is actually his home. And he gets pleasure daily from it. And he might be listening. I sent him the link, or his colleague.
Oh, fantastic. I'd like to go and see that. I haven't seen it myself.
Oh, I can give you the details.
Thanks.
So should we move on to the next one? Some of you will recognize this.
Yeah. I'll answer the questions in the chat.
Architecture can be described as a reflective modernism. It mirrors the true and original tensions of the modern movement through a search for form developed from a clear understanding of the building program, mediated not only by climatic concerns, but a broader concern for the genius loci. It is also reflected through its expression of the modern movement image, which is returned, reused, and reintroduced in an undiluted visible form, but in new and innovative transmutations. Fagin's architecture is reflective also because he pays conscious attention to and reconsiders the application of modern movement principles in a non-stylistic manner. He responds to tradition in a non-facile way. He manipulates new technologies and expresses new ways of making space, engaging with appropriate ways of living for current conditions. Fagin achieves what Martinson failed to do by merging principles of the modern movement architecture with those of the Cape tradition to generate a new and innovative architectural language. Fagin's 5 points for reflective modernism are unconsciously generated from his educational experiences, an appreciation of Le Corbusier's alternative design strategies, and the ability to synthesize these influences with the programmatic requirements of his clients and the exigencies of place. Fagin reinterprets the technological, functional, and spatial advantages of orthodox modern movement architectures to suit current conditions and merges these with the necessity for human connection with place and the past. He connects with place through a response to climate, views, materiality, and topography, all within a dominant form that is generated from both modernist and traditional typologies. Ordered planning configurations that often rely on served and servant relationships are tempered by formal manipulations that connect the building to their site through location, to orientate north or face views such as DS, and House Swanepoel in Hermanus 1990, or with planned stepping to create privacy such as in House Raynham in 1967. The open plan is balanced with cellular spaces such as DS and House Leven in 1969, while chimneys and walls act functionally, structurally, and traditionally to imbue buildings with a dual historical and contemporary sensibility. Fagin's fascination with effective design can be traced to his childhood tinkering, his motorcycle business, a UCT engineering training, and the pragmatic education he received at the University of Pretoria. 3 types of efficiency can be detected in Fagin's work. Firstly, the use of space, secondly, the minimization of structure and material, and thirdly, the response to climate. But Fagin mediates these scientific efficiencies with a spiritual nuance that imbues his buildings with unique experiential qualities. Spatial efficiencies are achieved through limiting circulation routes, more often than not positioned centrally on entry to create a binuclear plan, and reduced in length as far as possible with the limitations imposed by attenuated plan layouts. These echo the efficient layouts produced by Cole Bown in his courtyard houses in the 1950s. But where extended routes are required, passages become usable spaces, such as those as House Bertie Roberts in 1966, Raynham in 67, Neethling in 1983, and Aldern in 1992.
Service spaces are reduced to the minimum, particularly bathrooms, where Fagin's sailing influences are most marked. The bathrooms of Fagin's holiday home in Paradise are the most efficient, although possibly too cramped. Fagin often internalizes bathrooms to allow other spaces to gain views and light, but these configurations and size reductions in houses Swanepoel in Amanus and Bayers in Betty's Bay have, I think, led to uncomfortable arrangements. A Stark influenced efficiency is the use of roof space. In both pitched and barrel-vaulted examples, such as House Swanepoel in Cape St. Francis and Paradise, Fagin uses the room volume to create storage or sleeping spaces, while a doctor's consulting room is placed at the highest point of the roof in House Raynham.
Structural and material efficiencies are achieved through a limited palette, minimal use of materials, materials left in their natural state with few finishes, and the collapsing of structure and enclosure into one. Fagin defines these approaches as fitness for purpose, and his engineering knowledge and the efficiencies of boat building have been instrumental in forming them. Structural efficiencies are best achieved in the barrel-vaulted examples, where brick walls and roofs merge to form unified entities of structure and enclosure, such as House Paradise and houses Lukhof and Ida's Valley.
Material palettes are limited to clay, stock brick, concrete and timber, with very little use of steel. Fagin does, however, resort to a combination of steel and timber in his flitch beams, such as House Mitchell in 2005, when timber depths would have become too uneconomical and possibly aesthetically less pleasing.
Materials are left in their natural state except for brickwork, which is informed by the plastic nature of traditional Cape architecture. Even when unplastered, it is painted white to heighten the play of light and shadow. Internally, the only finish added is to the walls of bathrooms, where tiling is used, most often with rectangular proportions. In House Bayers in 1998, a concrete column and cantilevered beam system raised the accommodation to achieve optimal corner-orientated views. But these efficiencies are manipulated to aesthetic heights by Fagin's innate design talent through considerations of form, junction, size, and treatment. Structural and functional efficiencies best seen in House Bertie Roberts in 1966, where two in-situ cast cantilevered concrete beams support the building while acting as service ducts. These beams provide economical support as they limit the necessity of direct support on the ground. Climatic efficiencies are achieved through north orientation and the use of thermal mass, which, as Fagin indicates, is suitable for the Mediterranean climate of the Western Cape. Fagin mediates pragmatic and economic concerns and the concern for the human condition by spatial and material manipulation. Through this process, he haptically connects the occupant to nature, the surrounding contents, and the material palette. He uses light and view to accentuate important features by employing roof lights and window orientations, such as the entrance roof light at the S and bathroom roof lights in House Swanepoel in Cape St. Francis. Material differences heighten transitions between spaces, such as the use of suspended timber platforms at the S, Kerbos, and House Raynham, which mediate between hard and soft floor surfaces.
In contrast with Le Corbusier's restricted platonic volumes, Fagin exploits the vertical dimension of his houses to increase and decrease height, to accentuate movement and entry. The S and houses Raynham and Aldern are effective in their spatial constriction and release. These devices form a synergy between Corbusian and Cape architectural promenades. The visitor is taken on a journey that exploits the advantage of context through view, light, and sun. Views are exploited through focusing on the mountains at House Raynham and the sea at House Patterson, and sea and mountain at the S.
Contact with the sun and sky is achieved at Kerbos and houses Aldern and Swanepoel and Amanus through large roof lights that focus on internal gardens. Human touch is accentuated through anthropometric and proportional systems, and this is more evident in Fagin's early work, where time could be spent putting into effect Hambage's philosophies. The S best displays these approaches, where the entire built form is organized according to a proportional system, including door handles which respond directly to the movement of the hand.
Thank you. So, Arthur, you've been looking at the comments.
Yeah.
Do you want to vocalize any?
People, who was it? Ian who was asking me whether if Gawie ever told me about knowing other people in Cape Town that were working in the same vein. And I did ask him about that once, because there are obviously similarities between his work and people like Colleen and Meyering and Pius Pahl. He told me that he'd met Pius Pahl once, but he couldn't remember him very well. He never mentioned Colleen and Meyering, and there was another one who was working in Newlands, whose name escapes me for the moment, whose work is incredibly similar, and he told me he had met that particular architect. So I think that there was an understanding between them, that they were working in the same vein, but I didn't ever get the sense that they were discussing their work together or to critique their work amongst one another. By the way, I must also just add something to this presentation. There were many times when I asked Gawie about all of these things that I sort of uncovered in an academic sense. And his retort to me was always, "Wel, ek het nie eintlik so daaraan gedink nie." I didn't necessarily think about it in that way, which was a wonderful way of telling me sometimes, stop talking nonsense. If you'd been there at the time and you'd understood what I was doing, you may have a different view of it. But there was one wonderful answer to that, to a question I had, when I suddenly realized that these buildings that almost looked like they tried to float in the air and release themselves from the ground are actually quite grounded. Like the image you see in front of you there with that garage door in Amanus. And that was one of the ways of hiding the garage, by the way, was that he would push it underground and or turn it at 90 degrees, because he said the worst thing is to arrive at a house looking at a garage door. But I asked him at the S once about buildings being grounded, and he didn't answer me. He just looked at me over his glasses and he said, "Come outside." And he took me to the base of DS, and I'd never noticed it, that the skirting, there is actually a skirting to that house, and the whole house merges into the ground with this cove. I might have a photograph in this presentation, I'm not sure. So there were times when he agreed with me, and there were times when he told me I was actually just talking nonsense. I thought I must just add that in. Thanks.
More questions, comments? I just, do I sound very echoey?
A little bit, yes.
I just wondered about his new business development, his clients, and whether he had a waiting list, or there are a few, say, Afrikaans. Is there a pattern to the type of work he did for houses?
I think, do you mean in terms of the architecture that he produced for it, or the people that were initiating the project?
The people initiating it.
Yeah, they tended to be family members in the main. As I said, there were about 5 of his houses that were done by family members. But then also, I remember he did a house for someone who worked in his office. And then it was obviously acquaintances that he knew that would ask him to do architecture. And that the waiting list was evidently quite long. I'm sure people who worked in his office were able to tell you more about that. But I do know that he took a very long time to complete the design for a house. He would mull over it for months at a time, and the clients would have to wait.
Any more comments?
There was a question from Hannes Bernard. It had to do with the ties to Brazilian modernism. And he asked the question of Fagin's relationship to the state and to apartheid ideology. Whether you could comment at all on that, Arthur?
It's a question I never asked him, and I would not ask him, but I have my own personal opinions on it. In terms of relating to Brazilian modernism, yes, he in fact met Oscar Niemeyer when he went across on one of the yacht races and went to his office. Unfortunately, Oscar Niemeyer couldn't talk in English, So there was a communication gap, but they shared each other's work. And I think Fagin, his alliance with Brazilian modernism is probably not as direct as his interest in Portuguese architecture, and as he told me, the influence of Portuguese architecture on the Dutch. He was much more interested in that, and that's why there's an affiliation, if you look carefully at his chimneys, with the work that Pancho Guedes was doing in Mozambique at the time. And as I said, Fagin actually made a visit there as a student. I've seen he produced a little catalogue that's still in his office with photographs of all of Pancho Guedes' work. So the chimney that you see in Paradise, in my opinion, is a complete representation or understanding of that work from Pancho, but I don't think he was directly influenced by Brazilian modernism, more indirectly by the Portuguese.
Just one last question from Self-Advice, asking whether Fagin designed many non-residential buildings.
Yes, I indicated some in my response, but I think I made that a private response. Obviously, there's all the conservation work that he did from the beginning of his career, starting in Tulbagh, and the longest running project, which is the Castle of Good Hope. And then there are the molecular sciences building at UCT is one. There were additions to the Newlands Brewery, that's another. And then, of course, there's the Mike Sports development that's going on in Cape Town at the moment. There's also a very interesting tower block that he wanted to erect next door to his office, which I think was cancelled because of the economic circumstances of the times. And then, of course, yeah, the banks. Well, I think you asked beyond the banks. Yes, I think that's, well, there are probably others that I'm not telling you about now that I've forgotten about. But my main focus was on his residential work.
Right, should we go on to the next section?
Yeah. It's the last.
Modern movement called for a free plan, which was a reaction to the spatial and formal containedness of traditional examples. The intention was to provide flexibility of use in a healthy internal condition. The consequences was an abstracted spatial configuration that in its universalist heyday was devoid of cultural significance. The modernist typology had become self-reflective and removed from its direct context. Fagin recognizes that regional tenets of healthy space are still relevant, but that mediation is required between this condition and that of recognizable domestic space. Fagin mediates the requirement for open and flexible space with the cellular nature of quieter and more private spaces, all within a controlled container. Here Fagin cites the influence of dialectical cellular and open space in Le Corbusier's La Tourette. In House Raynham 67, the circulation route expands and contracts to form living, dining and playroom spaces, while at the S, the living room and raised dining room provide many spatial possibilities. As Fagin himself has remarked, I feel that today's house at least calls for a certain inner complexity to provide for various moods. Much of the detailing in Fagin's buildings mirror that of yacht design and construction, where a minimal amount of material is required to perform as many functions as possible and under the most extreme conditions. Fagin's pleas for the use of contemporary technologies and their associated processes. Fagin mediates the dialectics of technology and craft through the use of modern technologies and the manipulation of tried and tested vernacular traditions. He relies on the tradition of the Cape wall as both structure and support, collapsing Le Corbusier's canon into one. Most structural materials, save for plastered and painted brick walls, are expressed in their original state. Reinforced concrete is left in situ, sometimes even compromising the possible totality of the white wall surface at DS. Brickwork is often bagged and painted, as in houses Raynham and Swanepoel in Cape St. Francis, which creates a plastic mediation between traditional plastered forms and raw brick. Brick floors are, however, left in their original colour and texture, save for an applied linseed and turpentine mixture, the colour providing a connection with the earth, like the floors of old. Timber structures are hardly ever painted, but timber screens, doors and windows that form part of the wall often receive decorative colors to tie them mythically to their surroundings. The S is a tour de force of examples of the mediation of technology and craft, much more so than any other of Fagin's houses, due to his and his family's direct involvement in the construction process. It has been rather naively suggested that the syncopated roof was formed to echo the sea beyond, but the possibilities of views to the mountains behind and reflected light from the sea to the west, together with a search for plastic expression, were more pressing concerns for Fagin. The question was how to form such a roof in the strongest but lightest way possible, and as Fagin has noted, so that it would not fall on their heads. Frampton incorrectly describes the roof as a sinusoidal concrete shell, which belies the strength and thinness of the timber that Fagin was able to build with. The roof is in fact constructed of 6 layers of pre-planed pine strips, laminated on site and balanced over a central wooden beam. Although this talk focuses on Fagin's domestic architecture, it is important to note that his limited array of public buildings after the Volkskas banks were certainly more directly and formally influenced by the tenets of the modern movement. Fagin's development of his Roodepoort bank form for the Institute of Infectious Diseases and Molecular Medicine at the University of Cape Town in 2007 is a case in point. Here high-tech meets the classical through a concern for a contrasting architecture that responds directly to climatic concerns through its carefully located screens. Orthodox modern movement buildings were more often than not iconic in form. They dominated their landscapes, announcing their object presence. But it was perhaps the hovering nature of these buildings that divorced them from their context, creating alienating environments. The starkness of initial cubist forms later gave way to buildings that still announced their presence, but which attempted to connect with their surroundings through careful siting and material use. Locally, the shift in Pretoria from the white cubism of the Transvaal group to an architecture more sympathetic to landscape paved the way for future mediations. Fagin first synthesized the dialectics of background and foreground through his interpretation of modern movement planning and context in the banks he designed for Volkskas. The comment that "Ekskuus my dat ek hier sit" almost apologized for the existence of the buildings. Later, Fagin would synergize the modernist box and traditional cape forms with a deep understanding of site and its relationship to spaces around and beyond. Paradise, 2003, in Longabaan, is iconic in its form-making, but through its siting hides well below the road. But it announces its presence on the western ocean edge, particularly through its exaggerated chimney. House Aldern in Elgin, 1992, maintains a strong singular form, but digs into and straddles a hill, echoing a Frank Lloyd Wright prairie approach. I've tried to contextualize Fagin's work historically, theoretically, and pragmatically, but more important than these concerns are the qualities of space and experience that can never be adequately described or captured. In 2015, I was commissioned by Saint-Gobain to write about and capture South African architecture. The videos which follow are some of my few attempts at trying to elicit an understanding of space in Fagin's domestic architecture.
In 1967, Gawie Fagan designed this house for Dr. Raynham and his wife and their growing family. He, in those days, had a piece of equipment called a theodolite. And a theodolite is something that land surveyors use to measure heights of things, edges of things, contours, and all, basically an understanding of the land, the topography. And he used the theodolite to plot the edge of the mountain. So he did a drawing of the entire mountain, which is in his office somewhere, which shows all of the peaks and exactly their height above the ground, so that when he designed the entrance, it focuses on Devil's Peak. So that is one of the reasons the house is twisted, but also one of the reasons that the roof is tilted upwards. The roof is at its highest as you get to the living room space. The other important thing is the roof, which you can see is made of copper, and he refers to it as an honest roof. Now, what he means by that is whatever it's doing on the inside, it's doing on the outside. So there is no hidden ceiling or no ceiling hiding structure. What you see on the outside is the form of the roof on the inside. And it does that to, well, once again, allow the views up to the mountain, to allow light in above the dining room there. So in the morning you get the eastern light in. And then it molds its way down. So there's a scale difference between what is the living area, which is focused on the chimney, and then as you move down to the bedrooms, it becomes lower and lower and more intimate. But he does this because he likes his buildings to be rooted in place. He wants it to be rooted in their context. The wall doesn't hit the ground at 90 degrees, it starts curving its way into the ground. So here he grounds the house by the garage, and then he grounds it in its context by pointing up at the mountain. Because they come of an era, where things were rethought. So he contextualizes it through the things that I'm talking about now, about how it touches the ground and how it meets the mountain. But he also does it in terms of materiality, this white-walled architecture, which is very much of the Cape.
Where the house comes from is he was sitting in a plane, and we just bought the property, and he got the flash, and he needed something to draw it. He didn't have anything to draw it, and the guy next to him said, "What you looking for?" I said, "I need a bit of paper." And he said, "Yeah, you can have my cigarette box." And Gawie, on that back of that cigarette box, he drew out the whole house as it is today. As it is. Even the chimney, height of the chimney, when we had to redraw it properly to build out, he had to go back there. Vertel hulle van daar.
Nee, maar ek het het maar geskaal van die skets af. One tends to, if you're doing working drawings, you tend to lose the flair of the original, which is in some ways exaggerated. It's a quick sketch. And the chimney was, when we sort of started doing working drawings, we pared it down to what's reasonable, and then it didn't look right, so I found the old piece of cardboard and scaled it from there. It was grossly oversized, as I built it, in fact.
Because Gawie made all the tracks downstairs, all the woodwork, all his handwork.
We moved in when we built the lower floor and we put the slab over, and then we moved in.
We had this slab, and we had the walls up around for the different rooms, but we didn't have the doors in front. And the kids were so eager to get into each one in its own room because they'd all been sleeping around the house. So they used to tie their blankets around with a piece of string around, because if the wind came up from the front, everything went just wind.
Ja, die wind kan nie waai hoor.
Ja, precies.
So they all, that's the way they slept for a couple of months until we could get the glass in front.
People seem to have a weird idea that if you proportion the thing to the golden ratio, that it'll be beautiful. It isn't. It's the relationship of all the various things must be brought together.
Fagin and his architecture belong firmly in the Cape. The deeply rooted contextual design approach has resulted in a unique architectural legacy that has forged a mediated modern movement. In 2019, an inscription by Fagin was placed on the entrance wall to the Bokunda building at the University of Pretoria, his alma mater. It reads, "It is hoped that the students who pass through the doors of the Bokunda building are not seduced by trends and forms of an inappropriate West, but to practice the simpler qualities supporting responsible design that my generation spoke of, but mostly failed to apply, such as designing to suit the site, working with the weather conditions, topography, surrounding structures, and shared heritage, views, human scale, and sustainability initiatives, but most importantly, to practice good manners. May Fagin and his work never be forgotten, and may his architecture continue to serve as a lesson for all.
It was very moving. Thank you so much. Are there any comments or questions? Otherwise, I'll finish. It's 25 to 7.
No comments on the chat? Unless someone wants to pose a question now.
If anybody would like to ask me questions, you could forward them my email address, Kate.
Okay, no problem. Echoey again. You're quite easy to find on the Pretoria University website. So I'm going to finish, and thank you so much, Arthur. Nobody could have done it better, having done the PhD, and I really hope you find a publisher to get a monograph. And it's fantastic. There's going to be an exhibition at the Cape Institute of Architecture next month that you're coming to. So I know some of your students very excitedly have logged on, because of course you're a senior lecturer at CPUT before going to Pretoria to coordinate the master's program in heritage and cultural landscape research. And I know you've got a really important project of collecting the archives, drawings, plans, photos of important South African architecture, because we know in many countries a university will have an amazing archive of architecture. So again, please bear that in mind. And I'm conscious of the conversation we had at the last Culture Connect Zoom. Somebody did have images and plans from the chap who did the true form. So on that note, thank you again, everyone. And we planned this before Harvey Fagin died. He was very ill, and it's just added to the poignancy. And I invited Gwen to listen, and please keep up the dialogue. And I really hope, I know most of you booked for next week, same time, same place, for 5:30 for Arthur's talk on Pius Pahl. And he's just finished writing a chapter for a book being published by a university in Naples about Bauhaus architects around the world. And I'm delighted that Rudolf, who works at CPUT in the architecture department, also a doctorate, he is going to be talking a little bit at the end about what it's like to live at St. Martini, the flats by Company Gardens. We've got some super comments, thanks. Anybody who'd like a final word or comment, feel free, but I'm conscious we're slightly over time.
I would just like to thank you for the opportunity, first of all, and then also to everybody who's made such wonderful comments in the chats. Hopefully next week's session I will play down all the academic speak and talk a little bit more haptically about buildings and just illustrate my experiences in those houses at the beginning of the year.
I felt the academic context really helpful, and now I'm like even looking around my front room, looking at the detailing of the roof space, and it's the concrete exposed and the floors up like the earth. So thank you hugely for enlightening us. And I have to say, it was poignant. Yes, sorry. Someone...
I've got a comment from the son of clients who commissioned Gawie in a couple of houses, just and getting to know his work as a child, and particular houses in Francis Bay, seeing the roof form from the sea, a growing appreciation every year. We've been going there since 1981 or 82, and every year appreciating the form, the sculptural quality of the building he produced, and more then going on to study architecture, and then appreciation increasing. And even to this day, every time I go there, sometimes I look at the sea or face back towards the land and see the form of the building. It's almost more beautiful facing that way. I notice many of us get a huge pleasure when you're swimming in front of the house, always to see that roof form. And it's never ceased to bore me or kind of become tedious, even though the topography surrounding the building has changed completely. It used to be behind a dune and nestled in between the dunes, and now it's on a rock peninsula. And it's just a mark of a very skilled kind of visionary kind of producing that form, kind of very unusual form in terms of looking at the Cape vernacular, how it reinterpreted it, and that Eastern Cape thatch roof form and the chimney. So yeah, it's from a client kind of perspective indirectly, how the amount of pleasure it's given us all these years, and also that the family never really wanted to change the detailing of the interiors, the outer appearance of the building, and yeah, just a mark of success really. I mean, there are flaws in it, which we can have a chat another time, but it's kind of a master of his arts. That's what I have to say. Thanks.